welcome to another installment of the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council's webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us today. I, as always, am your host. My name is Imagine. I work on the TUFC board, and I work with the Southern chapter of the ISA as the Tennessee State Director. I am joined today by Alyssa Merca. She is covering for Katie Donaldson for web administration. So hello, thank you. She actually used to work on hosting the admin for this event years prior to me coming on. So really, this is just a reunion. I'm also joined by Kevin Bolger, our program coordinator for TUFC. But more importantly than that, more important than all of us really, is the fact that we have Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott here today. And she is going to be discussing tree myths with us. Personally, I've been wanting to get Dr. Chalker-Scott on for quite some time, so I am incredibly happy that she is here today. For those of you that may not know Dr. Chalker-Scott, I'll give you a quick rundown. We'll get into some administration, and then we'll let her take it away and start her discussion. So Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott has a PhD in horticulture from Oregon State University, and it is an ISA certified arborist and ASCA consulting arborist. She is WSU's Extension Urban horticulturist and an emerita professor in the Department of Horticulture. She conducts research in applied plant and soil sciences, publishes results in scientific articles and university extension fact sheets. She is also actively involved in enhancing the scientific literacy of her audiences by teaching them how to assess the credibility of information from print and online sources. A lot of her work has gone up in large organizations like the International Society of Arboriculture. She's done a lot of work with county agricultural agents, and she's also done a lot of work also with the Garden Communicators International. But she's here today to talk to us about some of the many things that she's learned over her long time in the industry. And so with that, I will pass it to Alyssa to talk about some housekeeping, and then we'll get started on the talk today.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
I'm getting a thumbs up. Okay, so this is just a housekeeping reminder that if you are joining us today and you want to claim ISA CEUs or SAF CFEs, please make sure that your Zoom participant name matches your full name that you registered with. So we need the Zoom report to match your CEU request. And there are some instructions here on how to do that. If you're unfamiliar, you can just click on the participant tab and then the 3 dots next to your name and make sure you change that to your full name. The other thing is that if you have questions for Dr. Chalker-Scott, you can put them in the chat and then we will leave a few minutes at the end of the talk to take questions. So you can put them in there throughout the talk and we'll address them all at once at the end.
Thank you so much. And one other note before we get started, you may have already seen it about 15 minutes prior to the call starting today. Kevin sent out the handouts for today's discussion. So for those of you that would like to follow on, Dr. Chalker-Scott sent out 3 different handouts for the things we're going to talk about today. So if you want to pull those up, please feel free to do so. And I'm going to go ahead and just pass it over. Please take it away, Dr. Chalker-Scott.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. It's nice to join you. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully it's going to work. Everybody see that okay? Okay, so this is a different talk for me. I mean, I've talked on these particular topics before, but never in the combination that I was requested to today. So kind of the underlying thread is some horticultural / arboricultural myths about how safe, organic, and natural things are. So my title for this talk, first time ever, is Mother Nature. And now it does not want to advance. There we go. Mother Nature, or is nature a mother? So before we really get into the topic itself, I just want to point out that when I was doing my PhD, I minored in biochemistry. And the field of biochemistry is especially plant biochemistry, is quite amazing. I remember my college professor telling me, and this was decades ago, that we don't know 10% of the things that plants make, and we don't know why they make these compounds. So one of the reasons, though, that we do know that plants make so many different compounds is as a defensive mechanism. Plants can't run away from threats like animals can. They're pretty much bound in place, and so they react chemically, chemical warfare. So that's kind of underlying much of what I'm going to talk about today. And also, we'll touch on another topic that is not quite having to do with chemical warfare, but is related to natural and safe. So what we're going to do, first of all, is just really briefly talk about how to evaluate information. And then near the end of the talk, I'm going to give you an example of how exactly to do this. First topic is going to be compost, safe and natural. Then we're going to look at botanical pesticides, environmentally friendly. And then the third one is native plants, the best choice. And so these are three things with question marks because these are questions. And the work that I have done either in the field and or in literature reviewing addresses these as things that probably aren't true. And then, of course, we'll have some time for questions at the end. So the types of information that are out there, and this is important when you're trying to figure out what to believe and what not to believe, run the gamut. So for myself as an extension educator, as an extension professor, I rely on scientific information. That's the gold standard. Not to say it's infallible, but that's where we start. It's peer reviewed, meaning it goes out to people who are also experts in the field and generally reaches an academic audience, not always. And for instance, this particular journal that I put up here, Horticulturist, is published by the American Society for Horticultural Science, and it is one of their three journals, and this one is intended primarily for extension outreach. So in other words, this is information that's good to go. So that's kind of a good place to look for information that is vetted and it's current and it's practical. There's also what I call the gray literature, and this is literature that is not peer reviewed. It's obviously edited, for clarity and conciseness, but it's not vetted for content. This is usually reaching a professional audience, nursery people, arborists, people who work in the arboriculture industry for a living. American Nurseryman is a good example of that, and it's been around for decades. And then the last type of information you find in print and online is the popular information, also not peer reviewed and meant for a public audience. So organic gardening would be an example of that. Now, the reason I mentioned these three specific journals is because I've published in all three of them. So my point isn't that one is necessarily better than another. It's just they have different audiences and they treat information differently. So you can find good information in the gray and popular literature as well as scientific if you know your author and you trust what they say, or you have a good way of vetting that information. So types of information, runs the gamut. I like to publish in all places because I want to reach the biggest audience possible. So then routinely I get the question after I bust someone's little myth bubble. Well, I've done such and so for 40 years. And I always say, that's great and that's important, but it is anecdotal. So what is an anecdote? And basically it's one person's observations. You would be amazed by the number of myths that I've come across over the years where it has started from literally one person's observations in their vegetable garden and has exploded into something that's believed worldwide. And the observations are fine, but they're not anything more than observations. They can be used for identifying new areas of research, which is useful for people that are doing that type of work like myself, but it does not replace scientific inquiry. In other words, it doesn't replace scientific experiments. And the reason this is important is because it goes through several checks and balances. One person's observations can easily be colored by personal opinions and biases. We're all biased, can't help it. But we have to get beyond anecdotes, and we have to look at the experimental process and trust that to be more credible than just one person's observations. So during an experimental study, you control the variability. In other words, everything is treated exactly the same except whatever particular product or practice or phenomenon that you're trying to investigate. But everything else is treated exactly the same. Plants are the same. Sometimes they're clonal. They're the same age. They're in the same place. Everything is the same to control variability. Secondly, you have to replicate treatments. So you can't just have one treatment and one control. You have to have multiples of those so that you can do statistical analyses. Without statistics, again, it's not something considered to be scientifically sound. So you have to have the variability controlled and you have to have good statistical analyses. Thirdly, you have to repeat the experiment. So if it works the first time or doesn't work, you run it again. And at the very minimal, if it turns out to be the same results, either it works, doesn't work, that's publishable. But oftentimes, especially with things that are done in the field, there can be some other variables going on. So sometimes it'll work, sometimes it doesn't. And so then you have to do it again and again and again. And many times you can never get past this. And a really good example of this, which I'll not talk about today, is research on compost tea. Because compost tea is not a recipe. It's a broth of living organisms. It's never the same, and the results rarely match up time after time. And so it's one of those things that's very difficult to look at the effectiveness because there's no way to control the variability. And then, if that wasn't enough, you have to go through peer review, and that's what requesting confirmation is. So you write up your work, it goes through a double-blind process, gets reviewed, gets published hopefully, and then other researchers will try it to see if it works, especially if it's kind of groundbreaking. People are going to repeat it to make sure that it works, because science does evolve, but it has to evolve with proper checks and balances. So we know by looking through the history of science that there's all kinds of paradigm shifts, but a paradigm shift doesn't happen just with one study. It has to be repeated, it has to be confirmed. So what I developed years ago is of course as a academic, I came up with a longer name, the credibility objectivity sieve, which I've now shortened to the CRAP test. And what this is taking raw material, which in this case would be, you know, the information that you find someplace, and you put it through the sieve of seeing if it's valuable information, and you might get gold or you might get crap. And what crap stands for is credibility. How credible is the source of information? The second part is relevance. Is this information relevant to you as someone working with trees in an urban landscape, or is it meant for crop production, two completely different agricultural systems? Is it accurate? In other words, is this the most current knowledge of this particular issue? There's lots of papers that are decades old, sometimes centuries old, that still hold up because what they've come up with as the results has not been shifted. But in arboriculture and urban horticulture, we're getting new information all the time. And so when someone says to you, I've been doing this for 30 years, look at them kind of askance, because I'm not doing the same thing I did 30 years ago. In fact, much of what I learned during my PhD was incorrect. And it's only because of the research that's been going on since 1988 that's shown that a lot of the things that we were taught were not accurate. And finally, there's purpose. What is the purpose of the person who's telling, or website that's telling you this? Is it to share information? Is it educational, like things through your Urban Forestry Council presents? Or is it something where they're looking to sell a product or a business or something like that? So be very cautious and think about what the purpose is of the information you're being told. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start with is compost, and I'm going to kind of back up a little bit to talk about how compost is used. And so this has to do with fertilizing plants, providing the necessary nutrients, in our case, trees. So the only way you know exactly what you're applying is if you use a commercial fertilizer. And a lot of people are not happy doing that. They'd rather use something that they perceive as being safe and not part of big ag. But the fact is that for something to be labeled as a fertilizer, it has to have a guaranteed analysis of what it contains. And if you're looking to treat a nutrient deficiency, it's really important that you know exactly what is in the nutrients that you are applying. There's things called biostimulants. Probably the best known one is Super Thrive, with all kinds of interesting marketing on it. A great thing to practice the CRAP test on. But biostimulants are very, very weak in their nutrient content, and it is not enough to qualify as a fertilizer. So it gets the unregulated name of biostimulant, which sounds really great, but whether it does anything or not is a question to answer. And then finally, you have the homemade stuff, fertilizers, including composts, and you don't know anything about the nutrient content. If you're making it yourself, you at least know what the feedstock is, but if you're just getting it from someone who's kind of giving it away somewhere, you don't know what's in it. And that can pose some issues. So what I always recommend before you just kind of do a wholesale application of fertilizer, regardless if it's from a bag box or from compost, is to test your soil or the media that you're using before you add nutrients. The best thing to use for a soil test is not something from a big box store or nursery. Those kits don't work well. You want to send soil samples or media samples into a government or university lab because that's where you're going to get really objective information without any kind of sales pitch. And it's not to say that private labs always do that. but I just prefer to use myself the university labs because they oftentimes are right on top of the game in terms of knowing the newest information on trees and nutrition. You want to get a complete nutrient analysis along with organic matter test, heavy metal testing, and soluble salts, because those are the types of problems that are in the soils or in the media sometimes, and you can't tell without having the test. University labs and government labs are really pretty cheap. I personally use University of Massachusetts at Amherst because our university in its infinite wisdom got rid of our public soil testing decades ago, as did Oregon and as did California. So it's really hard to get things done through university labs. But so I sent it off to UMass Am because they have been working with people outside of production ag for a long time. And so their analysis and their information to you about the analysis is based on something that's not ag production. So when you do this, you'll find out a lot of information. So I get mine run, every few years, and it cost me 25, 30 bucks, and I saved so much money in things that I'm not buying because I have a perception that I need to add stuff without really knowing. The things you'll find that will be high in any kind of managed landscape tend to be phosphate, magnesium, and calcium. And these things are heavily marketed to home gardeners, to arborists, to landscape managers. And by and large, they're not needed because we're working in landscapes and not working in production ag. So these are things that become deficient in agricultural production with annual crops, but they are not generally things that are deficient in managed landscapes. Sometimes they are, but most of the time they're not. So there's a lot of information on this, and rather than spending a time on this when you can read things happily on your own, I do have peer-reviewed information on phosphate problems, toxic levels on using magnesium in the landscape, and calcium. So those are peer-reviewed information. Those two fact sheets from WSU are not meant for a local audience. They're meant for a global audience. So things that are in there are not just for Washington State. They're for any place in the world. Let's look at what happens. So here's an example, and this is how compost is going to come into this discussion. So here's a soil test, and this is from UMass Amherst, showing obviously off-scale levels of nutrients in every regard, along with a soil organic matter content of 8.7, which years ago, when I was taught how we look at the percent of organic matter in soil, would have been ideal, because we were taught between 5 and 10% was ideal. Well, that number that was generated was for growing landscape plants in containers for production, because this is how you do the research. Everything is the same. Remember, everything is the same except for the variable, and the variable here is how much organic matter. So they found the best response in containers with trees and shrubs, 5 to 10% organic matter. Well, that's not a natural system. And the ideal organic matter is very dependent on your situation. It is not necessarily the same as somebody who might be a few miles away or even next door. You'd be surprised at how much variability there can be. But the reason I'm using this test is because this person who did this test, they don't use commercial fertilizers at all. They use only compost. And their organic matter, while it appears to be what we would think is ideal, you can see the nutrient levels are off scale. So organic matter doesn't necessarily mean rich organic matter, and compost is rich organic matter. It breaks down pretty fast. So because they're just using compost as their source of nutrients, they have nutrient excesses. So the advice I gave to this person is you've got to cut down the compost. Don't add it anymore for a while. And, when we're talking about mulches and things, we're using material that is not quick to break down and does not contribute to this nutrient toxicity. Here's another example of a test, same lab, and you'll notice in this case, we have optimum levels of nutrients, and one is a little low, that's phosphorus, and then the organic matter is 12.8. Several years ago, I would have said this is too high, and I think many people would still think that. Well, this is my soil, and we live in a landscape that has centuries-old Gary oak trees on it. So Gary oak is our local white oak. And those of you that are familiar with oak trees know how slowly the leaves break down. So this land has gotten centuries of leaf drop every fall, and the leaves have been incorporated into the soil naturally, giving it a very high organic matter, but it's a very slow to break down organic matter. So organic matter is high, but you'll see that the rate of decomposition is ideal in terms for levels of the nutrients. And just as a matter of information, we don't add any fertilizer to the landscape at all, not even nitrogen. The system regenerates its own nutrients. The return rate from actively growing trees and shrubs is about 90%. So we don't need to add anything. We have a mulching lawnmower, so nothing goes off the land, and the only thing that goes on is arborist wood chips as a mulch for the beds. So this is why it's really important to do a soil test, find out what you have before you add any rich organic matter, including compost. So those are those two tests again, just to show you, optimum versus above optimum and the amount of organic matter. When you get it on your test, it's going to be either what's ideal for you or it's going to be too high or too low. And it takes a few years of figuring this out until you finally get it to the optimum level. And then for your landscape, what the optimal level of organic matter is, because your nutrients will be in the optimal levels. The other thing I wanted to mention about compost, and this goes back to the whole thing about safe and natural, is it's not always great to use. Commercial composts, you don't want to know what the nutrients are. It's not a bad thing, but that's just the way it is. You can have it tested and find out, but you do know if it's contaminant free, if it's certified. So if you buy commercial compost, and I'll show you the seal in a minute, you'll always want to make sure that it's certified as being contaminant free, so you don't have problems when you use it. Homemade compost, we don't know its nutrient levels, and we don't know if it's contaminated or not. And this can be a real problem. So what we want to look is not only at the excessive nutrients and the toxic effects from the nutrients, we also want to look at heavy metals. And that's why I mentioned getting that done, because you can have chromium and other heavy metals in old treated lumber. You can have arsenic from residual pesticides from decades ago, and lead. So all these things are metals, heavy metals. They don't go away. They're elemental. They don't break down. They're just there. If they're there, they're there. So using certified compost will help, because it requires, if it's tested and certified, it's going to be tested for heavy metals. It will be tested for pathogens, and it will be tested for pesticides, which is really important to know before you use it. So you'll look for that seal that you can see right there. I've circled it, and close up, it looks like this. So that will tell you that it's been tested. You still don't know what the nutrient levels are, but you do know if it's safe or not. So it's one of those times when homemade is not the best answer, because you just don't know. There's too many unknowns, especially about pesticides, pathogens, and heavy metals. So this is a time when you want to be using things that you buy in a bag. I can't overemphasize this part enough. And so this has to do again with making compost from scratch. And I mean, I make compost. I've got a bin that has three parts. And so all of our yard waste goes in the bin. And then of course you have to use bulking agents. Our Gary oak leaves are part of that. And I used to use cardboard. Lots of people do. They'll shred up some cardboard and put it in there for the brown material. And it turns out, though, that corrugated cardboard has what we now know as forever chemicals. And this paper came out in 2023. It has nothing to do with managing trees. It has to do with raising chickens. But what connects these two things together is the use of corrugated cardboard shredded up as bedding material. So this was looking at the eggs and tissues of chickens and their contamination by various types of chemicals as a result of the bedding material. So I don't want to go into too much detail other than just show you one of the data tables looking at the contaminants. Now across the top, and I know this is kind of fuzzy, and I apologize for that. It was difficult to blow this picture up to the level it needed to be. It has, the first column is called TEQ. That's the toxic equivalence. It's kind of a sum of some of the toxins in there, and which ones are, the highest and which ones are the lowest. You'll also see PCBs up there. PCBs were banned in the US in 1978. They're still around. They're forever chemicals. Those are things that are highly toxic and carcinogenic. They're related to dioxin, but they're still around. Then there's some chemicals with names like polybrominated diphenyl ether and hexabromine cyclododecane. And those are flame retardants. Got used a lot, especially in like children's pajamas and in carpets. They're still used. However, both the PCBs and the PBDEs and HBCDDs have now been restricted in terms of their production, but the chemicals are still around. And the final group are the PFASs, or the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And these are still being produced in the US. They are coatings that are used to resist water. And this is why cardboard, all these things, is why cardboard is such a problem. Because when corrugated cardboard is made, it's permeated with or impregnated with chemicals that will reduce the absorption of water, breakdown. I mean, obviously cardboard is organic, but it's coated with things to make it resistant to breakdown, at least for a while. Otherwise, Amazon wouldn't have very good luck in sending their things all over the world in boxes that were going to get wet and then dissolve on someone's front porch. So, whoops. And so I just wanted you to see those first. And then looking at them close up, there were several things that were tested. Shredded cardboard is in this box, and that's compared to the control. The control are unused wood shavings. And the shredded cardboard, as you will note, it's the toxic equivalence, 9.84. It's highest of any of them, compared to the control material, the wood shavings, which is 0.33. And you can go through all these different things, but the PFASs, as I mentioned, being the ones that we commonly call forever chemicals, over twice as high as with other materials. So my point here isn't to tell you how to raise chickens, but to realize that if you use this material in your compost, you are putting all these forever chemicals into your compost, onto your soil, and they're stuck there. And they'll be taken up by plants, they'll be taken up by microorganisms and soil organisms, and they'll be passed on to animals and to you. So cardboard no longer has any place in my compost bins. I just recycle the stuff, get it out as soon as I can, because it's bad stuff, but it gets used a lot, not only in compost, but as a mulch. So please, 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 if you're mulching or using cardboard in compost, stop. It's not worth the risk. We're exposed to these chemicals enough as it is. We don't need to have additional sources that we can control. Okay, so now let's move on to botanical pesticides. This is one of many groups of natural types of pesticides, and the perception is because they're natural, they're safer, they're more effective, they're going to be better than synthetics. And as I mentioned before, this is what plants do. They fight chemical warfare. So there's all kinds of stuff out there that might have nasty effects on other plants or on insects or on browsers or on disease organisms. You name it, there's going to be something out there that is going to attack those things that would be attacking the plants. This is not by any means exhaustive, but these are some examples of things that you can find that are pesticides that are made from botanical derivatives. So azadirachtin is the active product in neem, and neem itself has many different chemicals in it. Azadirachtin is just one, but neem, if you buy a neem product, has many products in it. Essential oils, and those are made by many plants. So we'll talk about those in just a sec. Pyrethrum, I'm sure you're familiar with that, comes from chrysanthemums, which make pyrethrins, and then rotenone. So these are all insecticides, and they're all made by plants. So the question is, are they safer and more effective? And so we'll just look at that briefly by looking, first of all, at some LD50s of some of those insecticides. So nicotine, which is not legal to use, but is part of many, many do-it-yourself recipes, has an LD50 of 55, which is extremely toxic. Okay, so the smaller the number, remember, the more toxic it is. So the LD50, if you're not familiar with that, it's the amount of a material that will kill 50% of the population you're testing. So LD is lethal dose. So the smaller the lethal dose, the more toxic the material is. So what you're looking for is LD50s. They're large. I mean, you have to have a lot of stuff out there to actually kill anything. So nicotine is extremely toxic, but it's natural. Not safe, but it's natural. Rotenone, again, another natural product, depending on what you're looking at in terms of the organisms being tested, has varied between 132 and 1,500 milligrams per kilogram. 7 and malathion are two synthetics. And what I want you to notice here is that the numbers especially with malathion, are quite large, which is good. That means it takes more of it to kill you or something else. So it's not as toxic. And so because those are synthetics, they are more effective and they're less toxic. Now, it's not to say that things can't get resistant to them, but that's true of anything, not just synthetic pesticides, but natural ones as well. So pesticide, proper pesticide usage is always really important. And I'm not going to talk about that, but my point here is that a lot of things that are extremely lethal are natural as opposed to being synthetic. The essential oils are interesting to look at, and we like them because they all smell good. So things like black pepper and cedar, clove and cinnamon, garlic and limonene, which is the lemon smelling things in many plants, peppermint, rosemary, thyme, and wintergreen. Those are all things that are made by plants that have what we consider to be essential oils. And the reason is because you can smell them. And so there's an essence, and that's why they're called essential oils. So the fact that you can smell them means that they're volatile. Okay, and we love that. And we tend to be attracted by things that smell good or smell strong. And it turns out that especially in enclosed areas, they're really quite effective against certain kinds of insects. They can be phytotoxic to plants, though. So keep in mind, these are oils. And when you spray them onto plants, it's going to erode the cuticle of the plant and it can cause damage to the leaves that way. So just be aware the essential oil products can damage leaves because they do permeate the cuticle and break it down. If you're working in closed areas, beehives, greenhouses, other indoor spaces, they might work. They're very effective. For instance, I'm sure we've all used cedar oil to repel moths in cedar chests or cedar closets. However, outside, they're not effective because they dissipate very quickly, and you would have to have increasingly large amounts of this material to keep pest insects away. It just is going to dissipate. So even when you can't smell things until you're up close, it's the same thing with the insects. They're not going to be repelled by something that is going to quickly disappear. The products you tend to find on the market are mixed essential oil products. So they'll have a whole bunch of these different things mixed together. And there's been some research done on them, but it's not positive in terms of the outcomes. So here's some snippets from the research. Blending extracts does not ensure enhanced biological activity, for instance. Numerous plant-derived essential oil products have not been subject to rigorous evaluation. And products vary in their effectiveness against certain arthropod pests and are phytotoxic. So there just isn't research on these multiple oil products. And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, that if you're doing scientific research, you only have one variable. So maybe that's cinnamon oil, but it's not going to be cinnamon oil mixed with wintergreen mixed with clove, because that's three different things. And so you have to split that up and do each one separately, and then you'd have to combine them together. And all this research takes a lot of time and money. And unfortunately for us, urban forestry, arboriculture and horticulture for ornamentals is not considered to be important by the USDA, which funds a lot of research for things that are food products and fiber products. So lots of money for that, very little for doing things that are related to our field of interest. Okay, and I want to wrap up with looking at native plants. This is something that is a highly charged topic. People get very upset about it on both sides of the question. So we want to look at it as objectively as we can and think about, well, why we have this perception that native plants are superior to introduced species. So the plant I have on the left there is probably something you're not familiar with, at least not in your landscape. It's a native plant here. It's called salal. It's the Gaultheria chalon, and you don't have that, I don't think, at least not as a native. And this is what it looks like in its normal understory habitat. So it's got these beautiful glossy leaves. They're evergreen. They get used a lot in ornamental arrangements. So you may have seen it in a flower arrangement. Beautiful little pink bell-shaped flowers, which turn into nice purple fruit that birds and other wildlife love. So it is a great plant. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's great wildlife habitat, and it's a native. It's great until you plant it in an urban area, and it looks like this. Because where this is being planted is in parking strips, in traffic circles, in urban landscapes where it's not a shaded understory, which is where they evolved. They don't do well outside of their natural habitat, which is shaded and cool and moist. So we have to recognize that no plants are native to urban sites. They're not. Urban sites are quite different than what used to be there. And even if plants used to physically be there, the site has changed so much in terms of air pollution, drought, heat, increased light, salt from de-icers. Soils are nothing like they used to be. And there's lots of pests and disease now to take advantage of these very stressed plants. And so in Washington State, just like many other places, we try to use as many natives as possible. But sometimes we've been kind of foolish and specified natives only, and then they don't do well. And so then they die. You've wasted the resource, you've wasted the time, you wasted the materials, and then you have to plant something else. And if you don't choose wisely, then you just repeat the process. This is kind of what bothers me so much about many of these million tree projects, is that trees are not chosen properly for the site, and then eventually they're going to die. So we have to be really cautious with using native plants. What I did several years ago is I went through the literature to look at how nativeness affects the biodiversity of landscapes. And so we're all concerned with trees in our landscapes. And so primarily, I looked specifically at woody plants. So this would be trees and shrubs and vines. And I looked at the literature on assessing the biodiversity. So in other words, how many different types of insects are in these landscapes: birds, reptiles, other plants, mammals. What was the biodiversity and how was it affected by the presence or absence of native plants? So I had about 140 some papers and went through all of this, and it was published in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry several years ago. And what overwhelmingly was the answer was that if you select non-native trees and shrubs properly, in other words, you're not selecting an invasive species, you're selecting something that is going to be tolerant of your site, that they will tolerate the urban conditions, they will support wildlife, and enhance the biodiversity of urban landscapes. So the important thing with almost 100% of these papers wasn't whether they were native plants or not, it was whether they would support biodiversity by surviving and by being an asset, as opposed to not tolerating conditions and dying off. The important things about these plants is that they would provide resources to a lot of native insects and birds and mammals and reptiles and plants that they don't have anymore. So this is a really great example of something in our state, which this is the white-bottomed bumblebee. And it had been thought to be extirpated. In other words, it was locally extinct in our state for several decades because no one had seen any. And then about 20 years ago, this picture was taken by a bee enthusiast, not an expert, took a picture, sent it in to the Department of Wildlife saying, what is this bee with the white butt? And they were very excited because all of a sudden, here's this bee. We thought it was extinct in the state. And it was very happily on this picture, gathering pollen and nectar from Himalayan blackberry, which is a listed noxious weed. Okay, it is a hellish weed to deal with, but it provides resources. So we have to understand that insects and other types of wildlife are not static in terms of what they will use as resources. This is a basic tenet of ecology, is that when there's a new resource that becomes available, populations of predators or parasites or whatever are going to take advantage of that new resource. And that's how populations evolve. So you'll have populations that will start using these resources. They reproduce well, they leave lots of offspring. And so those genes become more prevalent throughout the species. So this is something that I never would promote planting noxious weeds. But the fact is that we may not like the noxious weeds, but there's a lot of wildlife that might. And so we have to be very cautious before we take kind of this black and white look at plants and just say this is introduced, it's a nuisance, it's keeping out our native plants, and let's get rid of it. Then you're going to be getting rid of the food source for an awful lot of insects and birds. So where you can have the greatest biodiversity, and this was uniform with I would say 98, 99% of the papers that I looked at was that if you had good vegetation diversity, in other words, you were having wise selection of appropriate native and appropriate non-native plants, you have lots of vegetation, it's going to support lots of wildlife. If you have good vertical structure, so you have ground covers, you have annuals, you've got herbaceous perennials, you've got little shrubs, little trees, big trees. You have this vertical structure is very important for providing habitat in terms of food and nesting sites for all kinds of things. So the cool thing about this is that all of these things, the diversity, the structure, is all very appealing from an aesthetic point of view. And people like these types of landscapes. One of my colleagues, Kathy Wolf, who you might know from University of Washington, does a lot of this stuff with urban forestry in terms of people's perceptions and liking of landscapes. And it's the same type of thing. They like things that have lots of diversity, lots of color, lots of vertical structure. And that's important to wildlife as well. So if you're interested in this, here's the title and the source for this analysis that I did in 2015, and it's pretty long and it goes into a lot of detail that, especially if you're working with the public or other clients, they're not going to have the patience for. I also developed a fact sheet based on the information there that's more kind of a hands-on practical guide to creating diverse landscapes, and in this case, home landscapes, but it could be used obviously in other public landscapes as well. So it's the same information, it's just in a different format. Both of those are peer reviewed, and again, is information that's valid worldwide. It's not just for Washington State. Okay, so this is where I want to talk a little bit about how you need to go through information carefully, even if it's peer reviewed, because sometimes peer review fails. And I'm sure lots of you have been familiar with, retracted journal articles, especially in areas like technology and human medicine and things like that, where there's a lot of monetary incentive to publish quickly and to maybe cut some corners, which is not a good thing. So you don't see this as often in our field, but it's out there, and it's important to be able to recognize it. So there was a claim made by a particular author that only native trees can provide resources for native insects, which is one of what things that people really truly believe. This paper was published in 2009. Doug Tallamy, you may be familiar with, was the primary author on this. It was published in Conservation Biology. So this was one of the papers that I actually reviewed for my literature analysis that I mentioned earlier. But it's important when you find something that appears to be an outlier to look at it carefully, because this is where you're going to find something where the new science is emerging or where there's something is just not good science. So this is the type of thing that I would pick up on and start going through, with a fine-tooth comb to figure out, why did this conclusion come up? And the answer is in the methods. So if you look at the methods, this is a direct quote. So they were looking at the ability of lepidopterans to use the leaves of a variety of different trees. And then they had to identify the trees. And so they labeled all the genera comprised of native species with geographic distributions in the mid-Atlantic region as native, 103 genera, even if the genus contained one or more species that had been imported for use from Europe or Asia. So they have combined native and non-native species in the genus and called it native, which is absolutely incorrect. You just can't do that. You've now kind of destroyed your ability to tell the difference between native and non-native, palatability for lepidopterans, because you've combined them together. This should have been caught early on in peer review and just say, okay, you've got to do this differently. You're going to have to separate them out. But they didn't. So in doing so, the authors folded 200 introduced species into native genera. Okay, so that means that things that came from Europe or Asia that were not native to the mid-Atlantic region are considered to be part of a native genus. The next thing they did was extrapolate the analysis to all herbivorous insects. So rather than just saying we're going to focus on lepidopterans, and many lepidopterans are very particular, they have very specific hosts, but not all herbivorous insects do, as I'm sure you know when you think of some pest insects that eat leaves. And their quote was, "We can think of no reason why Lepidoptera would not serve as reasonable surrogates for other folivorous insect herbivores," so other leaf-eating insects. I can think of lots of reasons because there's a lot of generalist insects out there and they're pests, and many of them are introduced pests. So it's not a good extrapolation because lepidopterans are notoriously host specific, and some have only one host, and that makes them endangered in many situations. So here's some results they show, and this is the 20 most valuable plant genera ranked from most to least in terms of their ability to support lepidopteran species. So I want to point out that this includes things like Prunus and Rubus and Rosa, which are 3 genera in our part of the country that have many, many introduced and noxious species in them. But they were all rolled into one. They weren't considered separately. And it's just not a good scientific experiment. And, as kind of the poster child for this, as I said, blackberry, Himalayan blackberry is a wonderful host plant for many, many native insects. And I'm sure the same is true in the Mid-Atlantic region. But the paper was very poorly designed, and you really couldn't extract any kind of valid information from it. So it was fatally flawed because it combined the native and non-native species all together and considered them all to be native. And it makes absolutely no sense. And I've been talking about this for 10 years now, and nobody has ever challenged my interpretation of the study. And a lot of people have gotten into it and have agreed that, yeah, it really kind of fell down. So it's not a good study. It's not groundbreaking. It was an outlier. And by and large, literature shows that having a biodiverse landscape is going to lead to increased wildlife diversity as well. So if a paper is at odds with most of what you understand about a particular topic, you really have to dig into it. It's almost impossible to dig into this deeply into every single paper. But again, unless you see red flags, there's no reason to have to do that. So the last thing we have to think about is we don't want to conflate correlation to causation. So whether it's native plants or whether it's botanical pesticides or whether it's homemade compost, we don't want to use something, apply something, and then say, okay, anecdotally, this is what I've seen. And so I've used compost and my roses grew much better than they did last year. So that was due to the compost, because we don't know that. So that's the causation part, and we have to be really cautious. It's hard to get away from that because it's so fun to find these connections. But there's a wonderful website that I found, and some of you might be familiar with, that helps especially talk to lay people about why it's really important not to assume that just because 2 variables are correlated and they're happening at the same time and they're changing the same way does not mean that one is causing the other. And so this website is called Spurious Correlations, and it's got tens of thousands of these things where they've done things like look at the per capita consumption of cheese that's perfectly correlated with the number of people who died by becoming entangled in their bed sheets. So, and this is the type of thing that will make people laugh. There's correlations with pirates and global warming. I mean, there's all kinds of really funny stuff. And it just helps you understand that just because 2 things seem to be changing at the same rate does not mean that one is causing the other. You have to test it to find out. You can't make the assumption. And we do this all the time. All of us do, including scientists. So it's not just something that's with lay people. It's everybody. You can't help it. It's fun to look for things that are causing other things. So one thing I would suggest if you want to download and read, it's a guide that my colleague and I, and she was the pesticide specialist for Washington State, we wrote on scientific literacy for the citizen scientists. So this is an extension bulletin, and it's just kind of a guide to how to look at information, how to put it through the credibility objectivity sieve, the CRAP analysis, and see whether information is good or not. It's a nice way to learn how to think about information. I have other science-based resources as well. This is my first web page, which was kind of just a compilation of all the different myths that I had busted over 25 years now of products and practices. Free downloads. These are all white papers, meaning that they're researched, but they're not peer-reviewed. But the references are in other resources. So the part of those other resources are found on my ResearchGate library. And if you're not familiar with ResearchGate, it's kind of where faculty and researchers talk to each other about what we've been working on, and we kind of load up all our information to share. And this makes it easy for anybody to find everything that we've written because it's kind of our own collection. So you don't have to go to Journal A and Journal B and Journal C to find particular papers. They're all at one place. So it's a great place to find things. All you have to do is go to ResearchGate. You have to create an identity. Doesn't cost anything. You don't get junk mail, but they want to make sure you're a person and not a bot. And then you can just type in the person's name, and you can find everything they've published. And this is true with many, many, hundreds of thousands of people. I've written books as well. Sometimes books are I'm the type of person when I'm reading for fun, I don't like to read on the computer or doom scroll through my phone. I like to sit down with a book. And so these two books are based on the white papers that I mentioned with the references. So it's all good peer-reviewed information on these various myths. A book on managing sustainable landscapes and gardens with 22 different authors, everything from, designing a sustainable landscape to troubleshooting. A book on how plants work, which is kind of plant physiology for non-scientists. And I'm a woody plant person, so it's primarily geared towards woody plants. And then if you're interested, there's a series that the Great Courses puts on. It's only available as downloads now. They don't sell DVDs anymore, but they are very generous in terms of working with organizations that are using this for educational purposes so that everybody doesn't have to download their own copy. You can get a copy to share in nonprofit types of situations. And it's 12 hours of the science of we called it gardening just to be more broad, but it really is the same types of things I've been talking about today that have more to do with managing landscapes than with growing vegetables. And then we have a blog, which has been going on since 2009. And you can see here, I got my soapbox to talk about correlation causation, but there's all kinds of things on various topics. We have pathologists, we've got the agricultural meteorologist is in Georgia is actually one of our posters. I don't know if you know Pam Knox or not, but she posts. We've got entomologists, pathologists, all kinds of people that write on this. And so there's always interesting stuff, and we try to post about once a week. And then finally, we have a Facebook group that is probably the best way to get information quickly because there's a lot of people in it, and it's heavily moderated, and there's lots of good information out there. So this is a discussion group that requires advice to be science-based. And so people can post, and they post pictures and explanations about what's going on, and then we all weigh in with what we think is going on. And with 27.5 thousand members from all over the world, there's usually somebody on sometime. And it's a great way to ask questions, or what most people do is kind of lurk and just read different posts, and you learn all kinds of things about all types of situations. I learn new stuff all the time because I can't be an expert on everything, and I certainly don't pretend to be. And it's just fascinating to read what my colleagues have to say about topics that I'm not very conversant on. So if you decide to join that, just be aware you have to answer 3 questions to make sure you're not AI or a bot or something like that. So feel free to join and see what other people are talking about. There's a lot of arborists that belong to this, a lot of tree people, so I think that you would enjoy it. So with that, I will open up for questions. And as I said, you feel free to ask questions, obviously, about this talk. But if we run out of steam there and you want to, feel free to ask about anything else.
Thank you so very much for doing this talk, Dr. Chalker Scott. As always, every talk I've ever heard you do has always led to me learning so much more, and it always exceeds expectations. And so thank you for going over so many subjects within a singular hour. It looks like we do have some questions in the chat, so I will let Alyssa take over. She can start reading the questions from the chat, and we'll get everybody's inquiries answered.
Okay.
All right. So there are 2 questions that I'm going to toss you at once because they're kind of related.
Okay.
The first one is, can you address the use of corrugated cardboard under wood chips as a means of killing vegetation before planting? And the second question is, does brown paper used for packaging and grocery bags have forever chemicals?
Okay, I'll try the grocery bag one first because it's a pretty short answer, which is probably not the same ones because that paper isn't manufactured the same way that cardboard is. That's not to say they don't have chemicals that might be forever chemicals, but I don't know. I would guess it's not nearly as bad as with the cardboard because it's manufactured differently. In terms of using under wood chips, you really don't need to. Sheet mulches like cardboard do more damage to the soil and soil organisms than help anything else. I talk to people all the time about why are you putting cardboard down? And they routinely say, I'm trying to smother weeds. So smothering and soil is not a good combination because you're not hurting the weeds any, because weeds are weeds for a reason. What you're doing is preventing oxygen from getting into the soil and carbon dioxide from getting out. So if you use a deep enough layer of wood chips, and for weed killing, I recommend 12 inches to kill, and then to maintain about 4 inches after the weeds are gone. You don't interfere that much with water and gas movement, but you do restrict sunlight, and that's what kills the weeds. It's not putting over something to quote smother them, it's keeping the sunlight away from them and they will die. So the kind of the magic bullet that I've used, and I've done it many times in restoration as well as using in my own landscape, is to mow weeds to the ground with either a brush cutter or a lawnmower or whatever works, and then putting down the 12 inches of wood chips and just wait. And you will be amazed on how well it works.
Okay, next question. What can you say about biochar?
Biochar is kind of neat stuff. I will tell you what my bias is. I always hate things that are prefaced with bio or eco because it always seems like a marketing thing. So when I first heard about it, I decided I didn't like it, but I wasn't going to say anything about it until I heard more. So I waited for a few years until the research started coming out. And it's really pretty cool stuff. It works better in subtropical, tropical environments than it does in more temperate areas. And you guys are warmer than we are, but where it works really well in our areas of interest, which would be, kind of urban horticulture, arboriculture, and urban forestry, is in kind of restricted types of landscapes. And so, for instance, if you have a planting pit or a green roof or something where your amount of soil is going to be restricted naturally, it's really easy to mix biochar into it. And it provides a lot of benefits in terms of microbial health and aeration and nutrient exchange and all kinds of cool things that it does. I do have a fact sheet on it. And so if you get onto ResearchGate and look for biochar, you'll find my peer-reviewed fact sheet on biochar.
Okay, next question. Do you have any thoughts on using biostimulants purely to encourage root growth for tree establishment and not as any sort of fertilization?
Now, if you're using something like rooting hormone, it's great. But the biostimulants themselves don't really do anything. Glenn Percival, who works for Bartlett Labs, has done a lot of research on a lot of products, including biostimulants, and he tested some really popular ones, including Super Thrive, and they just didn't do anything. So root tone and these other things, which are kind of the dips if you're trying to get things to root, are great. Pretty much, though, the best way to get things to root if you're talking about transplanting trees is making sure you take all the stuff off of the roots first and make sure you're planting them bare root. And that's the way to stimulate root growth. And that's a whole nother topic.
Okay, next question. Are you familiar with Agro Thrive product for home gardening?
I am not. So I will write that one down because this is what I love about doing these talks is I always find out something new. So Agro Thrive. So if the person asks the questions wants to type in what it's supposed to do while we're doing other questions, that would be great because I don't know about it.
Okay, next question. Since Talamy's paper, have there been better studies more narrowly addressing native versus non-natives with better controls?
Well, there was 140 some papers that I looked at. So there wasn't just Talamy's paper. There's over 100 others, and there have been some since I did the review in 2015. And by and large, they have the same, the same results is that attracting and retaining wildlife isn't necessarily a function of nativity and rarely is a function of nativity, only with certain things that have specific hosts, or if you're looking at some plants that are hemiparasitic that require certain host plants to have their roots attached to, that's a little bit different. But when you're looking at the bulk of plants that you'll find in urban landscapes, what's important is to have many choices and not have it restricted just to a narrow native palette.
Okay, sorry, I lost my I lost my screen when I shared my. Oh dear. Okay, sorry, I'm back.
That's okay.
Okay, so given that Ptolemy's paper is flawed, what would be the advantage of planting native trees?
Um, Well, planting native trees, if they're well chosen, is always a good thing because it's a sense of place. And so I think that's the one thing I wouldn't argue with is that native trees give you a sense of place. And so I should also say that lest you think that I am anti-native, I'm actually a co-author of a book on gardening with native plants in the Pacific Northwest. And so I am very much a native plant proponent, but only ones that have been tested that will do well under cultivated conditions, because a lot of native plants just don't. They don't like our soils. They don't like the types of things that development has led to in terms of soils and temperature and light exposure and all that. So um, sense of place, absolutely. When you're looking at historical things, I mean, nothing beats a tree that's been there for centuries, that's from the area. I mean, there really is a very strong emotional attachment. But if we're looking at having a um, diverse population of wildlife supported, it's important to do more than just natives, especially if there aren't a lot of good native choices. A good example is, for me, living in the Pacific Northwest, most of or many of our native trees are conifers, and they get very big. And obviously, they're not good choices for small residential lots or for urban spaces because they're just too big and they require things that we can't give, and they often cause problems because they're so large. So, well-chosen plants are the key.
Imagine we have a couple more questions, but I know we are over time. You want to give me a thumbs up or down if we should keep going?
I'm happy to stay. So from my perspective, I'll stay as long as you want, but I know that you might have some restrictions.
Yeah, I was gonna say, as long as Kevin doesn't give me the thumb down, then we've
Okay.
gone over before if there's more.
Okay. Are you knowledgeable about tree injection?
I am. Um, and I know that injection, especially for disease issues, is an effective way of dealing with those. Tree injection for nutrient supplementation is a really bad idea. So, we kind of have a perception that, we can inject things for ourselves, um, whether it's nutrients or medicine or whatever, but the way that trees naturally take things up is through the roots. And so the best thing to do is just have a healthy root zone and apply things naturally so it's taken up naturally. What I've seen is some pretty horrific pictures of when injections have become colonized with fungi or bacteria. So you get a big infection line through the tree. So I don't recommend it.
Okay. Is there significance for microorganisms to use along with nutrients or fertilizers for healthy soil, or mainly focus on soil sample and adding what is needed?
Good question. So yeah, soil test first, find out what's needed in terms of nutrients, and then just, kind of tailor your nutrient application to that. I can't overstate how important in terms of tree planting that using arborist wood chips is as a mulch. There is nothing that will replace what a natural mulch will do. So this is one of those times when imitating nature is the best thing to do. And anytime you go into a forest system and you see what naturally falls on the ground, and it's leaves and twigs and various types of debris, and the best way to imitate that is by using arborist chips. Bark is not a good substitute. It's full of wax. It does not get colonized by mycorrhizae. And if you want to have healthy trees, I'm sure probably everybody knows that having a good, healthy population of mycorrhizae is crucial for that. And they are supported by wood chips because not only do they colonize plant roots, they get into the wood chips. They're also decomposers. They're not disease organisms, but they do decompose organic matter, so they will extract many of their nutrients from decomposing wood.
All right, we have a follow-up to the AgroThrive question from earlier.
Oh, good.
So it's made from industrial fish discards and has worked well for some home gardeners. So this person just ordered some, but they're questioning the mercury and other contaminants from the fish meal. They say it's marketed as an organic biofertilizer.
Fish fertilizer tends to be highest in nitrogen, which is good. I mean, I have used Alaska fish fertilizer, which is what we have over here, only if I don't have over amounts of phosphorus, and only if it's been certified. So this is when the certification is really important, because you're right, things like mercury and possibly other metal contaminants would be important to know about, especially if you're fertilizing a home garden, because when you're putting heavy metals into a vegetable garden, you're risking some problems. So in terms of it being made from fish, I don't have a problem with that. I think it's a good source, but I would encourage looking at the nutrient, especially the big three, the NPK on top, and make sure it's not too high on the phosphate, because that tends to be a problem. And also, if it's possible to find out about contamination from heavy metals, that would be crucial.
I was muted. Sorry about that. What are your thoughts about using, I'm gonna mess up this pronunciation, I'm sure, imidacloprid to treat hemlock woody adelgid infestations?
Oh yeah, imidacloprid. Yeah, right. No, it is a tough one.
Okay.
I know that one of my colleagues, Bert Craig, who's up in Michigan, has used it a lot, and it has been fairly effective. Um, Oddly enough, that was one of the or a relative of that was just called cloprylamid, which is a broadleaf killer, contaminated a bunch of compost on the east side of the mountains and got brought over to the west side and killed a bunch of people's gardens. So again, is kind of the concern is that with the contamination for the residue that might be from the tree. So I don't do pesticide application myself. I'm not licensed to do so. But what I've seen about treating woody adelgids, that woolly adelgids, that works fairly well. I would check out Bert Craig's research from Michigan State because he's done a lot of that work.
And then Alyssa, I'm just going to interject just because we're getting at the 10th minute mark over the call. I think, did you hit all the questions except for maybe one more? If there's time for one more, we can hit it, but I think after that we'll cut it at 12:10 or whatever time you're at 10.
There is one more question. I think you've addressed it already, but using the 12 inches of wood chips instead of cardboard, does that still allow for oxygen and gas exchange in the soil?
It does. We did a test of not using 10 inches, 12 inches. We used 10. Let me back up. We didn't use 12 inches. We used 4, and we did some lab tests to look at the interference with water and oxygen movement. And the wood chips were the very best mulch to use. The sheet mulches going from cardboard down landscape fabric down to plastic were horrendous in terms of restricting oxygen movement. So the nice thing about the wood chips, because they're very coarse, is that they don't interfere enough with oxygen and carbon dioxide gas exchange to cause a problem to the roots. And though we haven't tested that directly, what we have done is a lot of research using up to 12 inches of wood chips on tree planting and finding that we get the very best results with 12 inches as opposed to 8 or 4 or none. And that's because both of weed control and just keeping the environment moist and healthy for both the roots and for the microbes.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chalker Scott. Thank you very much, Alyssa, Kevin, everybody at TFC. Thank you, attendees. Our next call is going to be June 19th with Chris Graves. We're going to be doing a course on tree ID for the summer. So please join us in our next discussion. And again, thank you all for your attendance and time, and have a great day.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed being here.
Oh, we enjoyed having you.